Good evening to you and welcome to this program of Globespan. Tonight's discussion it should be an interesting one because we have a panel of gentlemen who are pretty knowledgeable on the issues that we're going to be discussing this evening. We have, of course, regular guests, Mr. Ravi. We have Ramharack, David Hinds, and Professor Terrence Blackman. And so we'll be talking about wealth in distribution in Guyana, whether that's skewed or not. But before we do that, the elections in the United States have just been completed. And I know that you gentlemen who have been following the developments in that country and those who have been living there, some interesting things happened preceding the elections. And, might not have been what was expected. I think a lot of people expected the Republicans to perform better, but unfortunately, I think people are more sensible than we thought they were not. Gentlemen, you are Professor David Hinds, Professor Blackman, Professor Ramharack. You gentlemen have, and even my dear friend Ravi, what are your thoughts on the election first, and then we'll possibly talk about what are like impacts you believe on the politics and relations in Guyana. So I don't know, Ravi, you want to start? First of all, what are your thoughts about the outcome?
I'll take a stab. Yeah, I don't think it should be a surprise of the level of interest, apart from the furor over Letitia James's comments in the last few weeks. We have had a relationship with the United States going back to the 1960s, and if we didn't learn from that time, that, as the saying goes, when they sneeze, we get a cold down here, then something ought to be done to us. So yes, I think the United States elections are very important in terms of Guyana. And one of the things I like to caution everybody whenever I talk about this, that in looking at America and looking at ourselves in our relations with each other, what governs American interests is they always say that there are no permanent enemies or permanent friends, just permanent interests. So as we look at the American election, our interest should be as to what are those who are elected, how do they see their interest vis-a-vis Guyana? I think that's the main thing. So we have the Republicans coming out, it appears, with a slimmer majority than they thought they would have in the House, because typically during midterms, the votes swing about 20 to 27 seats. So I think what is projected now, NBC projected that they'll end up with around 222 to the Democrat, about 213. So it's a much narrower margin, but yet they'll be controlling the House. And therefore, whatever Biden's agenda may be as it unfolds, it'll be more difficult for him to execute that because the Republicans will have a say. And as far as we are concerned, the deep partisanship that has characterized American politics for the last decade or more, it also plays out in their foreign relations. And therefore, I do think it will affect us. Take, for example, the outcome that predicted. Are we okay there? Okay, yes. In terms of our localized politics playing out in New York City, I don't think anybody expected Letitia James to lose her seat. yet her victory was much narrower than what the polls had originally shown. But I think even more interesting is that now that the Democrats have lost their majority in the Senate, Pelosi will not be the speaker any longer, and therefore Hakeem Jeffries' possible elevation to that position, because it was thought that Pelosi would step down, is now a non-starter because the position will not be theirs to begin with. So that'll be my initial comment on what I see in the elections.
You want us to jump in?
Ramharack?
Okay. Well, before this election, I think the general feeling among some people was you're probably going to see what they term a red wave, meaning you will see a lot of Republicans getting elected and so on. And I think the hope on the side of the Republican was that they would be able to put a stop to whatever President Biden was trying to do. So they were hoping that they would control both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So I mean, it's not a presidential election, and generally, as Mr. Dev says, you do have people who will ride on the wave of the president. If he's popular, then people will kind of gravitate towards him and his policies. So therefore, it makes sense for him to support certain candidates. So I don't think we have seen that sort of a massive red wave as people were talking about. But the votes are still being counted. So the decision on who controls the Senate is still not going to be done, I guess, until maybe Friday, because it seems like Arizona or one of the other states are asking that they have until Friday. So they have elections here too, believe it or not, election issues. But certainly the House. I mean, the House is important because, and it does seem like the Republican will control it. According to the U.S. Constitution, the House deals with all kinds of issues dealing with taxation and finance. So that's kind of built into the Constitution. So the new Speaker of the House, assuming it's not going to be Pelosi, is going to have some kind of say in how things. And basically, what they'll try to do is to kind of, put a check on what Biden is doing. Unfortunately, it does seem like we're probably going to have some kind of a stalemate. We don't have a parliamentary system here, so the president, I'm sure you folks will agree, will be there for the next 2 years, right? There's no such thing as a vote of no confidence. So you're stuck. And so if it's a stalemate, and it seems like, you have the radical and the conservative elements who are going to go head to head, unfortunately, we may end up having that kind of situation. So not much will probably get done. But there are some things, that we see. One of the things we see, for instance, is the governor of Florida, who actually, I think he won by 20 digits. So, and he's been touted as a person, who could possibly be a leader for the Republicans. So that may put a spoke in terms of those who support Trump. Now, New York, where I live, is a blue state, meaning it's a largely Democratic state. Again, it was a close race. Not very close between the incumbent, Democrat, and Zeldin, who opposed her. So that didn't pan out. But there are some gains that the Republicans have made. Now, in terms of the broader foreign policy, I don't see much changing here. Biden is still there. I think the U.S. will still be concerned overall in terms of its policy to kind of, as they have done with Guyana, is to make sure that the democratic climate still exists. But I do believe that there'll be more pressure on some of the Democratic leaders to focus on issues, as we've seen, for instance, like promoting inclusivity. I've seen today in the Marara Waves, there was a statement made by the the U.S. Ambassador in Guyana. And so I think you will see more of that. That's going to continue. But, the U.S. will still be concerned in terms of its broader foreign policy, trying to keep the Chinese out of the region, concerned about things like halting drug trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, and so on. But certainly you're going to see that connection being strengthened in terms of trade. I mean, Exxon is there, right? And that's a powerful multinational corporation. So the U.S. Will try to work on strengthening that, that angle in terms of trade. So you're not going to see any change in that. So there's a future role here, I do believe, with this government, and I think the U.S. will be concerned whether it's true, the lobbying efforts by folks out here. I think the concern will still be to keep the U.S. involved in terms of what's going on in Guyana. So we'll have to see. But in summary, I don't think this is going to change anything in U.S. foreign policy. It's going to make some changes in who controls committees in the House of Representatives, because the majority party, will have their chair people installed in these committees. And even though they're there for 2 years, it is a powerful, institution. And as I said, anything dealing with taxation and finance. So we're probably going to be more affected here in the U.S. Than the folks out there outside of the U.S.
Mhm.
Blackman, what are your thoughts?
So perhaps I should begin at where Baytoram sort of ended. I did note the words of the U.S. ambassador urging Guyana to be more inclusive and at a faster pace, in the sense, go beyond some of the cash grants by focusing on sort of long-term growth for all nationals. And I think this is, in a sense, consistent with the kind of inclusive message that, in a way, sort of won the day here in the United States. I think as a colleague noted, there was a clear expectation of a red wave. People were already sort of fitting themselves out for victory, and I think that there was a real strong sense that on the part of many people across the United States that some of these, in a sense, some of this had gone too far, and Democrats showed up, as was just noted, and perhaps not fully appreciated. The turnout in this election was far more significant than the turnout that is usually the turnout that one expects for midterm elections, and I think that this bespeaks a certain kind of vigilance on the part of the population as it relates to these questions of securing the democracy and ensuring that that the democracy is an inclusive one. And as you mentioned Florida's Governor DeSantis, I think one should also mention the winning of the victory by Wes Moore in Maryland, one of the first African American governors of the state of Maryland. I have a friend who contested for the governorship in Arkansas. He lost, but he ran an excellent race. He won. It came very close in the state. Lost the race to Sarah Huckabee. So I think what this speaks to is that the kind of runaway sense of not caring and really pushing the democracy, I think has sort of come up against the forces in the culture that have been quiet, but who want a kind of more prudent, radical, consensual center in the democracy, and I think this is good. I certainly think that it's I would say for Guyana what this means. I think it augurs well for Guyana in the sense that that there are forces which will help to temper the excesses of Guyana. As we can see, the ambassador is already clamoring and asking in a very serious way about inclusivity and about ensuring that the benefits of the oil economy sort of redounds to all Guyanese. So I think these elections are a good reflection of where we are here in the United States, and they augur well for Guyana in some very real way, in terms of balancing the forces that are at play in Guyana and hopefully creating some space for a middle ground to emerge that begins to look at the platform that is necessary to move the country forward. So, I'll leave my comments there.
Dr. Hinds,
yeah, I think there are a couple of narratives one can take away from these elections. The first one is, 6 decades of theorization about midterm elections have been defied by these elections. I mean, the old theory that the president party would lose big at the midterm. These elections have proven that theory to be wrong, and it's the first time in 60 years since John F. Kennedy won big for the Democrats, or the Democrats won in 1962 in John F. Kennedy's midterm. This is the first time that the president's party has not really lost. So I think a lot of questions will now be raised about this settled theory about midterm elections. The second narrative I would say is, despite people are saying that American democracy was saved, I would say American democracy is still in question. Half of the electorate voted to give the Republicans control of one house and perhaps 2 houses. They have, after what happened on January 6th and Trump's behavior, for half of the electorate to still vote to put those people, and you have about 155 deniers who were re-elected to Congress. So I think the story of the saving of American democracy is premature. There's still a critical mass of Americans who are prepared to vote for the Republican brand. And I think it's too early to be shouting about saving of democracy. Kenny said the West is in trial. I think we can invoke that and say American democracy is still very much on trial, even after these elections. The third narrative is the fact that African American candidates did very well in statewide elections. Believe it or not, since Reconstruction, we've only had 6 senators elected statewide, 2 governors. And when you look at Cherry Beasley in North Carolina, you look at Letitia James in New York, and you look at the fellow in Arkansas and Maryland, that Dr. Blackman thing, and you look at some other races, you are seeing better returns for African Americans in statewide races. I rather suspect that a lot of it has to do with the activism and the reliable voting bloc, that's African American women, which is the most reliable voting bloc among Democrats. Interestingly, African Americans' registration rate is about 66%. But once they register, they then vote in larger numbers than all the other ethnic groups. So the turnout among African Americans tend to be over and around 60%. And that is remarkable. While you may have a larger registration rate among whites, they don't consistently vote in large numbers as African Americans. The other narrative is the the Rainbow Coalition that Obama won with, that Hillary Clinton did not embrace, or they didn't embrace her, but that Biden embraced and people were skeptical of, seems to have gotten life again. So young voters, both white and black, heavy African American turnout. I've not had a chance to look at the Hispanic numbers and Native American numbers and the Jewish numbers, because that was the Obama's coalition that won in 2 elections and that Biden to some extent took advantage of. But the turnout of young voters, both white and black, on issues such as abortion and democracy and so forth, points to a kind of ideological input in these elections that is not normally there. Americans don't vote on ideology; they vote strictly on things like race and so on. Race is the only thing that white voters tend to agree on electorally. So it's more an eclectic kind of approach to elections. But this time, on the question of Roe versus Wade, abortion and so on, you tend to see the young people injecting some ideology in the process. So I think it's a significant election. Whether it will lead to a realignment in American politics, nobody can say no, but you have a lot of food there to work with. As it relates to Guyana, I think nobody should be surprised that African American elected officials in America are now commenting negatively on the government of Guyana. Once the conversation was about elections, they weren't so much interested. Once this conversation moves to things like inequality, structural racism, extrajudicial killings, African Americans understand that kind of language, and they are going to link faith theory of black politics will kick in. And so when Letitia James makes that kind of intervention, it should not at all be surprising to us. And in many regards, the larger American establishment is going to take the cue from the African American officials. One can criticize the Rickford Burks and other, but I am saying the shift that we are seeing in terms of African American elected officials in relation to Guyana is not because of Rickford Burke, but it's in spite of the Rickford Burks and others that you're seeing that it was inevitable. I remember during the 5 months arguing with Freddie Kissoon on that issue, and he said African Americans, politicians would never. And I told him, watch, right? Because there's always been a foreign policy aspect to black politics. Show solidarity with African diasporan communities, whether it was apartheid in South Africa or helping to remove baby doc and so on in Haiti. There's always been a foreign policy aspect of black politics. Sometimes black elected officials are slow to understand the politics of so-called developing countries, but once they get their teeth into some of the issues, you then see the outcomes that we're seeing right now in the United States.
But hope we understand that there has been a lot of interplay, even in the American elections. We've been watching some of the videos on Facebook where the Indian community in particular were being urged to vote for the Republicans because one speaker was saying that, look, it's the Republicans who were responsible for the change in government and bringing back democracy to Guyana and so on. Did that really have an effect on the outcome in those communities, do you believe?
Who you're asking?
Ravi, what do you think?
Well, I think one of
Ravi.
the, coming back to that whole Letitia James intervention in Guyana politics, upon that meeting that Rickford Burke convened, was to mobilize the Indo-Guyanese community in Queens. I don't think they have ever been well organized as traditionally the African Guyanese community of Brooklyn have been. They have been much longer, along with the rest of the West Indian community. When I went to New York, I went to Brooklyn College, and Flatbush was then very much Jewish. And I saw, West Indians like myself from all the other islands, including Guyana. It has now completely changed, and Letitia James, is from that area there. Hakeem Jeffries also, where they're interlinked with Caribbean people very, very intensely. The church has played a great role in that. The church is very strong in these communities, and therefore they've been exposed to these politicians, as is usual in American politics, to use those fora to take their message. So I think what you're seeing, however, is, in my estimation, when I lived in New Jersey, but I used to go over to Queens. The community was just beginning there. And I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, whether this initial spurt of activism in the Indian Guyanese community will now be fanned to grow and to bring their numbers into bear, as is the American way. It is as American as apple pie. We may talk about Tammany Hall politics, where politicians, have their constituency that they can invoke with just a wave of their hand, and their ward captains bring out people. I don't think we're back there yet, but it's still there, where immigrants still can be mobilized to bring their, their concerns to bear. So I don't think that the Indo-Guyanese mobilization in Queens was very significant, but I think it's a beginning, and I would predict that that kind of mobilization will continue. In a sense, it has opened up their eyes to, I think, a potential power that they have in influencing change at a higher rate. I think the Indians from India, they have been much more adept in participating in the American political system, and you see all over the place at all levels, you're seeing Indian from India. They've been elected, and the Guyanese have really lagged. So, for example, Letitia completed her meetings before the election in Jackson Heights, a traditional area for Indian Americans. That's interesting because while the Republican fellow completed his election campaign in Richmond Hill practically. So you can see that there's going to be a change there. So again, I want to conclude by saying in this election, I don't think the Indo-Guyanese had any particular impact on it, but I believe it is the beginning of a mobilization that over the years, their numbers can matter, because at the very minimum, we are told there's about 200,000 of them in the New York metropolitan area.
What's your view, Dr. Ramharack?
Well, I think the issue is twofold, right? One is, as Mr. Dev says, the issue of mobilization. But I think the other major issue is that of getting people educated to the process, and then obviously the next step would be to get them registered. So I think Indians are coming from Guyana are pretty much sort of a new immigrant here, so they don't have that organization that's already exists. For instance, when African Guyanese are coming here, through the churches and so on. So that's a whole process that's been going on, whether you trace it back to the 60s and the civil rights movement and so on. So it was easy to have that alliance. And I don't think it's very difficult For people like Jeffries, I know we keep calling his name, but I don't think it's very difficult, to be able to touch base with black leaders here and get them to focus on what's going on in Guyana. And I do think the issue of racism, discrimination does have a significant impact, and folks will respond to that. So I think with the and I don't have any data to back this up, but having lived in parts of Queens, I can tell you one of the challenge has been to get this community to be registered, to get them acclimated to this whole political process and get them involved. And that has always been a challenge. And if you look at some of the people, who have run in the Richmond Hill area during elections, I think that's one of the complaints, right, that they have made over the past. On the issue of, how Indians would react to whether it's towards Jeffries or Letitia James, I think it's a natural reaction. If we're making the assumption that the rational voter in the United States or Guyana will vote on the basis of their interests, I think it's a natural phenomenon to assume that Indians, if they were, going to vote, they would have that, that image in their head. So therefore, they may be Republicans because in their mind, it was a Republican administration, that pulled them out of that morass after 5 months. So I think that, again, I know people would say, well, they're Republican, but I think that's something we have to accept, because if we're saying that people vote on the basis of their interests, and as countries do act on the basis of their interests, then I think that's a reality we have to accept. And I think that if you maybe do some research and survey on this, you would find that most of the Indians, whether they're in Richmond Hill or other places, I'm seeing most of them would have been sympathetic to maybe a Republican, despite all of the images that comes out of the Trump era. I think you would see support for that, because they believe that the savior was, a Republican administration, and I don't think they'll forget that easily.
Uh, Dr. Blackman, from what Ravi and Dr. Baytoram would have said, and the response at the meeting that was organized by Burke and the coming out of the mayor and so on, do you see a kind of similar, can we say it's a reflection of Guyana happening in the United States in terms of polarization?
Yes, but let me, since I have this opportunity to say, I think what this reveals is a kind of way in which our politics is fractured. So first, let me say, in my role as a professor at Medgar Evers College, I've had on a number of occasions the opportunity to interact with the Attorney General and with Congressman Jeffries. These are individuals of the highest caliber. It is unfortunate that our sort of small politics of Guyana can cause us to speak in a way that in some communities one might perceive as extremely demeaning to people who have really worked tirelessly on behalf of the community. So, for example, Letitia James has been a leader in the development of Medgar Evers College, the Medgar Evers College Prep High School that sits there. She's been one of its strongest backers. In certain kinds of struggles. So I think that I wanted to sort of put that there. The second issue sort of always arises in the context of Rickford Burke, and I think again I think it's important. I think it's important for us as a government of Guyana to not engage Mr. Rickford Burke in this manner. In the sense, Rickford Burke is someone, again, who has been active in support of a community, and there are many people who feel very strongly that that you know, I mean, think for a moment about the police in Guyana issuing a wanted bulletin for, you know, a normal citizen in Brooklyn. You know, it smacks. It's not the kind of thing that really ought to be happening. And I think, I mean, I welcome this opportunity for folks here to say, you know, we should not condone the use of the government in that way. You know, Rickford Burke is an American, and he's entitled to speak, and he should be allowed to speak, as Guyanese should speak on these matters. So I think I've kind of said the issues as they relate to the individuals who are a part of this. So now to the specific question of the Letitia James's, the Attorney General's intervention on behalf of what she perceived as kind of some treatment that was untoward for Afro-Guyanese in Guyana, and sort of saying that she would use her office to impact that. And again, I think that is completely normal, as was evidenced by, we started this program with a statement by the U.S. Ambassador Sarah Lynch, who says, look, Guyana is an ethnically divided society, and so we will need to focus on inclusion, and that there have been many efforts to do so thus far, but we will need to do this at an increased pace. That's diplomatic speak for you know, things are not all the way that they ought to be. And I think it's unfortunate that our Indo-Guyanese brothers and sisters who live here in the United States, who are aware of these things, are in a sense not more sensitive to these issues. So, you know, I think there are two levels of what I hope we can maybe turn the corner on and move beyond the kind of deadlock politics, which is to say, one, it is completely normal for what is occurring to occur, and two, there ought to be more sensitivity on the part of the Indo-Guyanese community here in the United States to some of these matters. And it is surprising that we get to this sort of place where, you know, someone is a bullhorn, and, you know, yes, politics is important, but I think we know enough, and we've been involved in enough of these things to understand that perhaps that is not the most effective. That is not the target of the politics, and it was no surprise that Letitia James won, and won handily across the state of New York. So I think it's a bit unfortunate politics, and one hopes that, you know, as a community we can do a bit better in terms of our understanding of what's going on.
Hinds, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I share a lot of the sentiments expressed by Dr. Blackman. My first response was that those fellows in Queens who were urging Indian Guyanese to vote for the Republicans were unprincipled. If you believe that your interests are better served by Democrats, the fact that an African American official gives solidarity to African Americans in Guyana should not then force you to change from voting Democrats to Republicans. That was my first response, and of course that was I would say a partisan response. But looking at the thing in its broader context, I would say what we've seen in Brooklyn there, around Letitia James and so on, was inevitable. Inevitable. But once the Americans got so involved in our elections, to the point where they put the pressure of the American state via sanctions on one participant before the elections were declared was significant. Usually, Americans would put sanctions on you if the elections are ended and you refuse to leave office. Or as in the case of Venezuela, where they feel that you're against U.S. interests and they put in, sanctions on you. Very seldom do they sanction one participant when an election is not being called, and that was significant. Now, once you do that, you open up the kind of engagement that we are seeing now, where our political response in America would be driven by what happens in Guyana. And we could be heading to a situation where Indian Guyanese would take a certain position, support of Democrats or Republicans, and Africans support of Democrats. Now, of course, that would be unfortunate, but it's inevitable. We know very much the Cuban situation, where the Cubans in Florida support the Republican Party over the Democratic Party because of what happened around the Bay of Pigs and so on and so forth. We may well be going down that road. And like I said, we can say that it's unfortunate, but it's inevitable given the nature of our politics and given the way in which the Americans intervened in the 2020 election. It was too much over the top. And you are bound to have blowback, you're bound to have reactions, you're bound to have perceptions of who is my friend and who is not my friend. It wouldn't occur to me. Gregory Meeks, in a sense, came down on the side of the PPP during the election. It would never occur to me to say to African Guyanese in Brooklyn or in his constituency, don't vote for him. It just wouldn't occur to me to do that. All right, I disagree with him, but I would not say to African Guyanese, don't vote for him. In the same thing, I disagree with Mia Motley and Ralph Gonzalez and Golden and the other fellow there from Barbados, the former prime minister. I disagreed with their position on Guyana, but it would never occur to me to say to Guyanese in Barbados or St. Vincent, don't vote for them. It just wouldn't occur to me. So I think we are looking here at political culture. We are looking here at a shift in political culture, and that going forward as Guyanese, our political culture, which we have developed a semblance, not full-blown, but there were a minimum of values that we held. That once we're in America, we are all Black. You know, our fate is linked. We'll join the African Americans. We'll vote Democratic, and so on and so forth. That is now being changed, and I am afraid that our political culture, both at home and abroad, is being affected by what happened during those 5 months.
I was going to that.
Deon, let me just come in here. I want to react to a couple of things that both Dr. Blackman and David said. The first one is about Mr. Burke. Mr. Burke committed certain acts which, in the view of the law enforcement agencies in Guyana, they felt was unlawful, illegal, and he has been charged. So that is something on the books that is there. As to whether he is guilty or not, that is something for the courts to decide. So we have to accept that there are at least probable cause for him to be charged. And I notice he of recent has made a counter charge and filed a case. I think UC Anderson filed a case for $500 million against Gail Teixeira. So these are legal matters which we can't deny in terms of the fact that they were made, as to whether they are going to be proven, he's going to be proven guilty or innocent. That's left for down the road. So coming back to Miss Letitia's outburst, I would say, or reaction in terms of taking this visceral position on behalf of Mr. Burke without looking into the details. Some of the claims she made as to what he is facing were totally incorrect. So what I would like to say in going forward, I see another unfortunate development in terms of the overall so-called democratization in America, or where democracy stands. My position is that, unfortunately, America is leading in a wave of populism that is now sweeping the so-called developed democracies. So you have a far-right leader in Italy. You have one in up north in Finland or up there. So populism, in the sense of people picking on leaders, picking certain grievances and reacting against scapegoats, reacting against these elites that they'll blame for all their troubles. So in a sense, you split things very simplistically. And that is, to me, what I see the danger in American politics going down that road, where they are very simplistic analyses, if you may call them that, or solutions, like Trump blaming everything on immigrants or on China or what have you. And this, to me, is what Letitia James fell into a very simplistic populist response without looking into the nuances of what she was dealing with. And I expected better of her, because similarly, Mr. Jeffries, I went back there, I remember Mr. Jeffries' uncle, who brought that charge against City College, one of the, the pioneering efforts to fight racism in America academia. I have respect for these people because you have a history. And I don't think she did justice to that notion of being nuanced, of being understanding, of not accepting these simplistic labels. So to conclude what I want to speak to both David and Terrence, I see that the danger, that what will play out here now, unless we move back from this populist position, and it's happening in Guyana too. So take, for example, denouncing Trump and his group as election deniers, as David did, for doing the exact identical thing in Guyana, which I wrote a column and a letter last week, talking that the PNC is going down that road, or the opposition is going down that road of this populism, denying what occurred at the last elections, denying all of that. We don't need that. I think we got to be much more nuanced if we are to work out of this morass that we find ourselves, both here and in United States.
So if I may add also.
So if Ravi, okay.
Just quickly, and I don't want to repeat, what's been said. I think we have to respect, and I think what concerns me here is, when we talk about a political culture in Guyana, it is a fractured political culture. And my concern is we were kind of sort of making the argument that one side has the moral authority to speak and do what they have to do. When we talk about people, and it seems that's the sense I'm getting here, that Indians will vote for a Republican, and maybe not support Burke or Letitia James, we have to respect, if we're saying that they're going to vote on the basis of their interests, we have to respect that, because they come out of a tradition that they've seen a situation in Guyana and they are reacting to that. And it's the same way that blacks in America are responding to what is best in their interest. Regarding Rickford Burke, I've seen a video clip that is going around social media where he's saying, and I'm quoting, that Georgetown must burn. Now, that's not something you want to be able to spread, because it seems like Rickford Burke does have a lot of clout, because the PNC is also very fractured in Guyana. And I would add this. When the PVP was elected in 1992, I was in a debate with Mr. Rickford Burke in Queens. And one of the things that he was gung-ho on is that this election in 1992, coming out of that long tradition of PNC oppression and rigged election, was that the 1992 election was rigged. And Mr. Burke was on that panel with me, and that was the position he held. When you look at what they are doing, and I want to put the onus back on what they are doing. When they make that lobbying effort on behalf or to try to convince Letitia James or Hakeem Jeffries, somehow that concern about the other half of Guyana. We talk about America with this election. It is a very divided society in the United States right now. So we have to recognize, and we always have to put our foot in the shoe of the other folks who are out there. So I don't see that element of what Rickford Burke or what Letitia James are doing in terms of lobbying on behalf of all Guyanese, and that part of the element is missing. And I think we seem to be giving legitimacy to what he's doing, but there are some things that he's doing that may be that may be dangerous for Guyana, because if he has that tremendous influence in Guyana, because the PNC is really fractured, the leadership is not strong. The language he preaches, again, if he's saying Guyana, Georgetown was born, then that is going to be a problem. And I think the Guyana government has to respond to those things, and especially when that kind of language is being fomented in a society that is very fragile. And I think we all agree here, that Guyana is a very divided country. Nobody's denying that. And I think we have to be careful how we kind of proceed with that. And I think that would be part of my concern about this whole narrative about when we talk about the Guyanese political culture.
Can I?
Yeah, but while you respond, Professor and Dr. Hinds, you don't ask you to respond, David. While you your response, how do you factor in the U.S. ambassador's intervention during the elections in Ghana and Letitia James's position in relation to situation in Ghana? Can we draw a parallel in terms of do we say that it was wrong from the election commission and so on? As Ravi is trying to say that Letitia's coming out is really out of place. Go ahead.
Are you asking David or me?
Me? If I go, yeah, Deon, look, I disagree with Ravi and Baytoram. This is not about Rickford Burke. It is not about Rickford Burke. Letitia James's intervention is no more simplistic than the U.S. Secretary of State's intervention under Trump. What his name was? I can't remember his name now. All right. If our intervention is simplistic, then his intervention was equally simplistic. And the U.S. ambassador to Guyana, Pompeo, was equally simplistic. Because I would think that Letitia James understands Guyana more than Pompeo would ever understand Guyana. Yet Pompeo's intervention is seen as principled, and her intervention is seen as simplistic. No, Ravi, it's not about Ravi Dev. It's not simplistic. Our intervention is grounded in a history of Black linked fate. And I stressed that at the beginning. It is easy for a Letitia James to smell what African Guyanese are claiming is happening to them in Guyana. The program is not about whether their claims are right and wrong, but the fact that she hears it. It's not about Rickford Burke. It's about something deep within the Black belly. And so therefore, to reduce our intervention as support for Rickford Burke and not as support for the complaints of African Guyanese, I think misses the point. And like I said, in any case, if she is simplistic, then Pompeo and others were more simplistic than she was. Yet they are held up as saviors of democracy. No, democracy is not just about elections. Democracy is also about extrajudicial killings, the right to life. Democracy is also about equal distribution of resources. Democracy is also about fair wages for those who work for the government and those who work outside of government. Democracy is also about equal access to resources in the society. I understand that Indian Guyanese hold up elections as their narrative of suffering, but African Guyanese also have narratives of suffering. Extrajudicial killing, like I said, the right to life, is very much a part of it. And so therefore, when Letitia James speaks to that human rights, that right to life that African Guyanese are talking about, she's not being simplistic. She's grounding in a long historic relationship among peoples of the African diaspora. I hear a lot of my friends, for example, say that they thought highly of me, but now they don't think highly of me because I didn't validate one narrative at the last election. Well, those same friends don't say anything about extrajudicial killings. They don't say anything about the young woman who was arrested for telling her client not to speak. Look at the lawyers who were on the street. 90% and more African Guyanese, our Indian Guyanese brothers and sisters were not out there. And I am not condemning them. I'm saying that Indian Guyanese see election as genocide. And African Guyanese, on the other hand, see extrajudicial killings as genocide. And one is not superior to the other. And until we come to understand, and Ravi, you have written on this, until we come to understand that each group has its own suffering and no one is superior to the other, then we are playing with more trouble.
And that's why I say, David, is that I expected Letitia. You see, when I agree totally with you, I'm the one who introduced the notion of linked faith in Guyana. Dyson's, linked faith back 20-something years ago when he even visited and we spoke to him. The point is, however, is that when Letitia invokes in that very visceral language of brother from another mother, evokes that whole race talk, it resonates in our divided society differently than in America. You get me? Where
Yes.
African Americans suffered, and the whole Jim Crow laws and all that. Guyana, I hope we will concede, is a country in which independence was given to an African government, led government, and ruled for 28 years and all that. So Letitia and others who intervene from outside have to be, that's the way I said, she was simplistic in terms of the language she used in intervening into a very combustible situation in Guyana. And I think she added flames to that. And I think we got to be careful there, because I don't think you can make a direct analogy of what happened in America versus what happened in Guyana. You can't do that. That'll be too simplistic. And the last thing I want to say is this. One of my sorry, go. Yeah.
Go ahead, Ravi. After you were done,
this,
Professor Blackman, I would like to hear your thoughts.
In our whole discourse here, David, one of my disappointments on, and I thought the opposition would bring this up, is that to put whatever is going on in Guyana here within some kind of framework of activity, rather than, this is when I call it populist again. There's no framework. So coming back to all the demands you have and coming back to what we were supposed to talk about tonight, inequality. No one mentions we are acting within that whole framework of the victory of neoliberal principles. And so if we want all the things you talk about, don't we then accept that it's not going to happen within a neoliberal paradigm in which the market makes all those decisions that you talk about there? You know, the whole notion of what kind of distributive justice should we apply in a country like Guyana? Nobody brings it up, and that's my frustration with the opposition. And I speak as one who sat as an opposition member. I say this, like I said, with my hands, you know, to the heavens. I was always an opposition member, you get me, who marched for, in 2004, Ms. Guyana complimented me, who spoke at the Square of the Revolution for a new voters list, for an inquiry into, you know, Gadraj's thing and so on. But somehow we get lost that we must have all of what we say or do. It can't be just reacting to racial commonalities based on, as you say, based on what, you know, the legitimacy of the same skin. That's being simplistic, David. It is being simplistic. We have to. I go back to Rodney and his analysis and how we're going to be thinking. I noted again. I want to finish this in 2014, Dr. Clive Thomas, in addressing some of these same questions of inequality and what's going on in Guyana and all that, he at least brought up within a theory as to the implications of what Piketty showed when if capitalism is to go forward, what's going to happen as it plays out within groups that are situated differently in any country. I close with that.
Yes, Dr. Blackman, let's hear your thoughts.
So we've taken a detour, but I think it's an important detour because in a way, we were aiming at, we were trying to treat the complex issue as if it were much simpler than we were in our conversation being a bit simplistic. And so it's good that we're kind of, in a way, going down this path so I'm not here to defend Rickford Burke or to defend Hakeem Jeffries or to defend Letitia James, the Attorney General of the State of New York. She can do that far more ably than I can. But I simply think that we should, in this kind of way, Ravi just made the point of the way in which something resonates. It's, you know, this is someone who is the Attorney General of the State of New York. This is not someone who is engaged in simplistic work. And so to kind of assume that, you know, her use of language, her defense of is something that was sort of done without thought, and maybe it's not the thought that one would agree on, but just to ascribe that character to this is, I think, perhaps not the appropriate thing to do. And, you know, we might want to rethink how we characterize their actions. I mean, and I'm sure, you know, I can offer a way to think about this, but I'll leave it to you to sort of see that that's perhaps not the most appropriate characterization of the actions of the Attorney General of the State of New York, particularly one of the first African-American women to hold that role, right? So I want to kind of leave that there. What I want to speak just for 1 second on the question of Burke. And again, I while we were talking here, I just quickly Googled what exactly was Mr. Burke charged for, right? And just to give a sense for Ravi, that it from a distance, and I think this is what we expect people to, that it's clear that this is not a situation where, you know, there is some, you know, well-defined legal process, and you know, when one reads the story, it you know, the reporters have implicated Burke as being someone behind some organization called GNN, and this is some, you know, a conspiracy to commit a felony. What is this? That these individuals were writing negative stories. And this seems, it's the kind of thing that from a distance, it's the reason why Letitia James would listen to this and say, this is the kind of thing we hear all the time when it's completely made up, and the actions that are being taken are not necessarily actions that are being taken for these things, but they're actions that are being taken because there's something behind what's happening there. And that is as clear as the day, and the antenna of many people are raised when they see that. So again, it's not to say that there is not a process, but one should look at the kind of flimsy nature of what is there and say, an objective observer reading this would think something is probably not right about what's happening there. And there's no need. And I think this is part of what I also find is, at times troubling for us. There is no need for, we devolve so quickly to the kind of, defense of our racial camps that we can't have a proper conversation about what has actually happened. And, we get so quickly to the place where we begin to demonize people that we can't say what has happened. What do we need to do? What do we need to change? What do we need to change it to? How do we cause that change? Because we can't have the conversation with each other. And again, you mentioned my last thought on, so I've dealt with Letitia James and Mr. Burke, and then Congressman Hakeem Jeffries. You mentioned your knowledge of his family and the role that they played in the African American community, not just Congressman Jeffries, but his antecedents, and so particularly in relation to Leonard Jeffries at City College. And so I think that when you speak to them, you should understand that in the same way that you kind of you speak to the way in which this might resonate in some community, one should also be mindful of the way that it resonates. Your words and your thinking about it resonates in some communities, right? And even just among the folks who are here on the program, right? So I think we have to find more nuanced and more life-affirming, self-affirming, community-affirming language to talk with each other, and not immediately devolve into our defense of our racial and ethnic prerogatives. These things, I think, ultimately are important. But if Guyana is to move forward, we have to find a way to have a substantive conversation across these lines that is respectful and holds all communities with a certain kind of dignity.
Well, you see, Terrence, this is where, again, we differ. This is where you're making certain conclusive statements when you should be held tentatively, which in terms, you're saying that the evidence is flimsy against Burke. I don't know. This is not my place as a trained attorney from New York. I wouldn't say so. This is the evidence. There were charges made, and based on those charges made, they issued a warrant. It is not for me to
Ravi,
pronounce.
what I'm saying is that
I happen to know those reporters. I know Gary Eliezer. I know them. So you can't make. So
I'm saying this is the Attorney General of the state of New York. This is not just some random person.
To her being very, I see this as a danger in America. This whole notion of the populism that has descended in, for example, in England on both sides. In America, I see the both sides descending into this populism and not holding on to liberal principles that has sustained democracy for so long.
Well, if I may,
just let me make one last point.
I think this is a reflection.
Yeah,
this is a
for quite a while.
Yeah, I think this is a.
And while you talk, Doc,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Finish up. I don't want to talk over you. But I think this is a microcosm of what we're dealing with.
Go ahead.
In Guyana. Just for the record, I took classes with Professor Leonard Jeffries at City College. I did my bachelor's there. And this is a time when City College was going through a process. And I think being part of that, I understood, or I learned about the Black concern at that time. And that forced me to leave Sophie Davis. That's a medical school. After a year, I gave that up and I decided to study political science and history. And of course, my parents went crazy. But when we talk about Jeffries, my simple point is that yes, there is a narrative, and I think David will agree with this. And he always says, I am speaking, my truth, and I'm speaking about African. I know them well. That's part of, that's part of who I am. And I think we also have to recognize, yes, Guyana is a society, is a multi-ethnic society, but it's also a divided. Nobody's denying that, there are many people, and I will tell you, who will say, look, and yes, elections is the way to go. Those people can't run a cake shop. They don't know how to run a country and so on. Yes, we have all of that. But the problem is we have that that divide that we need to go beyond. And I think, where Professor Blackman is agonizing is you want us to get over that hill. But the problem is this is where we are. And I think that, we were supposed to talk, we'll have to have another session on economic wealth.
We haven't gotten to the economics discussion yet.
But I think, we have been having this discussion for a long time, and I think all of us here would be dishonest to say that there is not a racial problem in Guyana. In my view, I think there are three issues that are going to be dominant issue. I think the issue of race and ethnicity is going to be one, right? I think corruption is going to be a second, and I think the issue of wealth distribution, which we were supposed to be discussing tonight, and I think those are the issues that will dominate, Guyanese politics, so to speak. But my point here is that it is a discussion that we have been engaging, with for a long period of time. And I think we have to understand, I think this is where the difficulty comes in, is we see our truth as the truth, and we don't see that there is another truth could be out there. So we have to find a narrative that really take, both elements. And of course, there's the Amerindian that nobody seems to talk about, Guyana's Forest people. They are now becoming part of the narrative. And I think the discussion about that, has to continue so we can find that whole. But one of the things I'm trying to grapple with, and I've done this for a long time now, is to make an assumption that we're all Guyanese. But Guyanese is really, a sort of, that's who we are in terms of nationality. But we're all different culturally. We come from different backgrounds. So instead of being one people, we should be, focusing on unity and diversity. We're many different people. So we have to find a formula that really gets us to a position where we can all respect each other. We may not understand the other side, but we have to understand that we're living in this territory, which we call Guyana, and we have to do that with self-respect and respect the other side and their views. Now, having said that, there are some issues that are going to be issues that we have to grapple with. When we say things like, we're talking about whether it's executive power sharing or, we want to be able to take the oil money and, apply it to all of these years of oppression and make it part of reparations and so on. That's all well and good. But my concern also is to understand that there's a narrative that also has to be taken into consideration. And that's the Indian narrative that I think that I always try to bring on the table, because I can tell you one of the things I'm doing now, looking at culture, right? In the 1930s, Indian culture, you got a head start because, Indians were fighting this sort of a colonial environment to be able to have that voice, to negotiate that space, right? But then that voice was eclipsed under the PNC regime, and I think that continues today. So my concern is, where is that voice? Where is that cultural voice? You look at the institutions in Guyana. We talk about discrimination. Yeah, it exists. But what about those institutions, that doesn't recognize the existence of other people, whether it's the army or the police or the civil service or the national cultural institutions? So I don't see all of those things represented. So when Letitia James, and again, I'm sorry to come back to her, as much as we may like her, when she does make that reaching out, I think she needs to understand that there are also constituency of hers, who may have different opinion, and she has to be able to take that. I can understand you come from that Black tradition. Yes, you're connected to to your people, but we live in a society where there are other people in Guyana who also have a voice, and hopefully, as a person who understands, who come from that tradition, will be receptive to the fact that yes, there are other concerns. So if I'm going to leave New York and try to get the folks in DC to listen to my perspective and what Rickford Burke is telling her, she needs to also understand that there's another narrative that has to be on the table. So my last point is that I know we're going to come back to this discussion on wealth distribution. I did a lot of research, but I think it's all going to go to waste. But I think it is an important topic, and like I said, that's going to be one of the three dominant topics we need to address in Guyana, and of course the mechanism as to how we're going to get there.
Deon, if I may respond to my, yes, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, if I may respond to
when we talk about this narrative that Ravi and Dr. Ramharack.
Oh, we couldn't hear you because your mic keep going on and off.
You're breaking up, Deon.
Oh, no, I'm talking about both you and Dr. Baytoram's idea that okay, there is this other narrative. You were saying that the court hasn't proven the case of Rickford. I don't know, and so on. But if you follow the record of what has been happening in Guyana in terms of the use of authority of the state and the police and so on against a certain section of the society, isn't it logical to conclude that this is not a trivial trumped up charge and allegation? And then
in the law,
is talking about the police force and all of that. And we're ignoring what is happening there.
No, you see,
has he really gone into looking at how many people? Look, currently the current Minister of Home Affairs, they're battling to get Indians in the fire service, in the police force, in the army. We can't force people to take up what they don't want. The idea that somebody's locking them out is totally absurd. Right? Nobody's locking them out of these positions, and you should know that. David, I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah. Well,
you address something for me. Let me respond to that. You see, what you're saying is that you must look at the general and then apply it all the time to the specific. In law, it doesn't work like that. You get me? You got to take in law, you take each specific case and you judge it on its own merit, not because a lady was, a working girl at nights in front of St. George's Cathedral. If she accuses a fellow of rape, the judge is not going to assume that, she's just pulling a thing there. No, you have to judge each case on its merit, and that's what I was saying there. That's right. Before pronouncing them innocent, you got to go through the lines, and at this juncture, it's still open. It's still an open question. We may have our assumptions, or all of us do. You get me? We may have assumptions. I feel the fellow in Skewed, Boston, who's his name? I think he was assassinated. That's my feeling about it. And I will speak that. But that's my feeling. But definitively, until somebody is brought to trial and tried and convicted, you can't say they're guilty.
But by the same token, there are accusations that there was an attempt to rig the elections. Until the election petition is heard and so on, it shouldn't come to a conclusion. But, one side has come to a conclusion. So I'm following your logic, Ravi. But I wanted to address the point you made about neoliberalism. And Dr. Baytoram also talked about the recognition of the narratives of the different groups. So I assume he's talking about the multiracial thing. Now, Ravi and Baytoram, you know that Black Marxists have always come to Marxism from our own experiences. That is different from European Marxists and maybe Indian Marxists or so on, right? C.L.R. James, the very Walter Rodney that is idealized by African Guyanese, right? Right? And to grapple with the question of race and class. Ravi, you introduced me to an interview that Rodney gave in Canada, where he said one has to deal with the question of one's own identity, racial identity first. One has to come to grips with the question of racism and anti-racism so that tomorrow one can join with other groups. And so therefore, this thing, I hear people say all the time, Rodney was a Marxist, and I laugh all the time because he was a Marxist, but like most Black intellectuals, he was more than just a Marxist. He was a Marxist, he was a nationalist, he was a liberal, because Blacks
and he was a Pan-African and a
Pan-Africanist. Blacks have always, all of us, as Dr. Blackman, we have had to integrate all these various strands, and the women will kill me if I don't say no. Feminism has to be part of this Black axis. So it's not about being a Marxist or being a nationalist. It's about all of that. And Ravi, my thing in relation to Guyana is that I would not allow myself at this time, when the central issue before us is about how we divide the resources that God has blessed us with in a racially inclusive way, as the Americans are telling us every day, even today. When that is the issue, I am not going to allow anybody to get me caught up in discussing neoliberalism, just to get me my eyes off the prize, so that they can carry on their thing. No, there is going to come a time when we will have to deal with the question of neoliberalism, but we will have to deal with it together. You, me, Baytoram, Dr. Blackman, Deon Abrams, and all others, we deal with it together. I am not going to allow myself to be distracted by that discourse. The real discourse, the clear and present discourse, as the Americans are telling us. I have to call the Americans now, telling us that the real issue before us is about inclusivity when it comes to the distribution of resources. So yes, I recognize class, I recognize gender, but that is not; those are not the central issues at this point.
And they also said to accept the election results, boy.
Well, I have not declared the winner yet of the election, you know. Ravi, I have never declared the winner of the election. I don't know who won, because both sides have presented their evidence. And I was waiting on the court to make a determination, but apparently the court will not be allowed to make a determination. So we will never know.
Yeah.
Dr. Blackman.
See, I'm not going to comment on elections. I think the question is, as Dr. Hinds rightly says, and I, let me say again what the U.S. Ambassador Sarah Lynch has said. Right? She talked about in the area of cash grants that have been delivered countrywide to marginalized groups to cushion impacts of flood and COVID-19. She said the Guyana government needed to do more. These short-term grants do not mean long-term sustainability. So we're encouraging them to focus on efforts that will create sustainable growth for the entire country, no matter ethnicity, no matter race, no matter gender, and no matter geography, because there's a bit of a rural-urban divide here. So I think that, we're being given the marching orders. And as Baytoram has nicely sort of characterized it, perhaps we have to, in order to ensure that no matter race, no matter gender, no matter geography, we somehow have to have some articulation of race, gender, and geography. But I think that that's the business that we ought to be involved in, and we need everyone around the table. And I would say further that some of these things that tend to kind of, exacerbate the differences between the Indo and Afro-Guyanese communities are precisely the things that distract us from doing the job that we need to do. And in a way, I sort of hope that our continued conversation here kind of gets us to the place where we start to, put forward some proactive, some rational, some objective ideas about, this area of cash grants. So in preparation for our program, I looked at the website for the Ministry of Finance. I was looking for data on wealth distribution in Guyana. Unfortunately, there's very little data. There's almost no data on the Ministry of Finance website that relates to wealth distribution in Guyana.
None.
But what one finds there is a number of things that have to do with cash grant dispersals. And it would be interesting, as sort of Ravi has noted, to have beyond a theory of crisis for the distribution of, but some kind of economic sort of animating idea that has been contributed to by all of the parties involved, saying, we're going to have to do the following things. We're going to have to find ways to disperse monies. Earlier today I was talking, I don't know whether you've read the article by Mosa Telford. There's an article by Mosa Telford in the Stabroek News. Mm-hmm. And so I read this article. And so the essential characterization is like, look, okay, I don't want to drink a whole gallon of the oil, but I want to taste a sip. And so we have to begin to think about ways to have an inclusive tasting of a sip across the society. And this is, I think, the argument that we have to bear down on. And it requires us to kind of, if I take your lot, it requires us to all be mindful of each other's narratives that we bring to but we have to get to the table and have to do the actual discussion about how the cake gets cut. Because if we don't, I fear, as the article that I really would recommend that to viewers, as the article that Ms. Telford wrote. It's a very well written article about, it kind of juxtaposes, this, $70,000 Wagyu beef with sort of some of the realities of the way in which people are living. And it speaks to the way in which, some economic issues are hardening. And I think that's the issue for Guyana. And if Guyana if we're not smart here, we're going to lose. And we have lots of examples of countries like Guyana losing this game. And so, that's where I'm coming from in this conversation. We have to talk about racial issues. We have to talk about issues of gender. We have to talk about the urban-rural decline. We have to talk about, what are ways in which we can diversify the army, but we also have to talk about ways in which we can diversify the banks and access to finance. And those are questions that will allow Guyanese to take advantage of the opportunity. And if we don't get there, then it will be to our detriment, and our children and grandchildren will judge us very harshly.
What is up? Discussion.
So you're breaking up.
You're breaking up. We can hardly hear you.
Mr. Abrams.
I don't know. Probably it's the internet. I'm saying that we've wormed our way into the substantive discussion for the evening in terms of the distribution of wealth and resources and so on. Do you believe, David, that, as Professor Blackman has said, information is not readily available in terms of how the government is treating with the wealth of the country? And we get a sense that operated to hide the necessary information that it will give us. We don't get information on the distribution of house lots in terms of, we get a big number, But in terms of the distribution by race and class and so on, and who gets what, you don't get this information. You normally get our big figures of 10,000 house lots distributed this week, 20 distributed this week. Who gets what? Nobody knows. All right. So, but wealth and oil and gas and the distribution of these resources, how do you factor that into the current interplay?
Gentlemen, I was told this was a 1.5-hour program.
Yes,
and
actually,
I have
Mr.
something
Abrams.
scheduled. And,
Yeah, we are actually over time now. If we could go to closing comments.
1.5.
Maybe we can continue with our
Yeah.
assigned topic at our next,
next time.
Yeah.
Next week, yes.
Yeah, it's too. We can't just polish it off. It's very
Yeah.
important and critical.
Yeah, we're close.
Closing comments, since I have to leave, is this: that unlike those in politics from both parties, I don't think we can neglect the ethnic question. This is what I've been saying for the last 32 years, having returned to Guyana, and it still is relevant. And this is the danger of ignoring the neoliberal paradigm, which ignores all these nuances and talks in gross terms about markets. David, and that's where I'm coming from. So in a sense, as an African Guyanese, I would think you need to weave that. And I'm, in a sense, I thought I was doing you a favor to present the complaints within a paradigm that goes to the heart of the matter, as Walter did back in the day when Marxism, ran rampant. In closing, this is what I would say, that we talked about that, both sides having their narratives and all that, and how do we reconcile them. Hegel, he looked at the play Antigone, and he came to a conclusion that, a tragedy is not really, the way we typically think of it. His view of a tragedy is a situation when it's not a matter of who is right and who is wrong. It's a situation where both sides have rights. And the problem is neither side would concede to the other that they have a right. And until we get to that point where both sides in Guyana concede, and I wrote this 20 years ago and I was castigated, from my community for saying so, that both sides have their rights, so to speak, in an absolute sense, which you cannot ignore. But to deal with it, you have to accept the right is grounded in how the individuals view themselves, which is ethnically in Guyana. And a lot of people want to skirt around that issue, and it ain't gonna work. So with that, I would like to say thank you, gentlemen, for a healthy discourse. And I don't mean any disrespect to anyone, including Letitia James or Jeffries or anyone else in my presentation. It's just that is my feeling as to where we stand right now. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you, Ravi.
I'll just make this brief. I know we went off topic tonight, and then we're going to have this discussion again. But since we're off topic, I'd like to introduce one more, which I think it's something, it's unfortunate that we don't have a female voice on the show. But one of the things that we're seeing, and I had a friend from Canada call me because he was so troubled, and he's a therapist. And one of the things, we talk about race and so on, but there's an issue which is really troubling, which we've seen in the last few weeks. If you pick up the newspaper, you see where women were chopped, they were set on fire, they were beaten up by the husband. And I think that is something, we're concerned about a lot of different things, bigger issues maybe, but this is a serious issue that I think, it's something, and I wanted to bring that out there. And I think for me, it's part of a therapy to kind of mention that it is an issue that you see every day, and it seems like nobody is speaking out, on behalf of these women. And that, again, that cuts across race. It's all over. So it's something that hopefully can be addressed at the national level by the people, who holds political power. So having said that,
Dr. Blackman.
Yeah, so I actually, I'll close by saying something. Uh, in a conversation sometime back with Dr. Vibert Cambridge, we talked about communication and the importance of communication as a way of constructing a sustainable future. And I think that this is, at this moment, we really have to think deeply about how do we communicate with each other across these racial and ethnic and, as you just identified, gender lines in a way that allows us to share our knowledge, and in a way that allows us to envision the future and to kind of motivate the action that is necessary to make that future work. And I would say, and this was something that emerged in our conversation. I think we have to go back and look at the historical record, and we have to look for places and look for times and look for circumstances when we have seen a cohesive Guyanese action across a race and class lines. It is this kind of thing that is necessary in order to move us forward. And we're not going to move. I mean, trust me, we're not going to get there if we're constantly, doing things that antagonize each other and force each other into camps that make it very, very difficult for people to, to act with goodwill across racial camps, across ethnic camps, across the gender divide, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I see clearly now this point is about communication and finding ways to communicate in a way that will nourish and transmit and share and envision a new future and motivate the action that is necessary.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would like to take off from where Dr. Blackman left off. And as a veteran of one of those moments, that is the Rodney WPA moment of the 70s and the 80s, where we moved to some kind of racial cohesion, ethnic cohesion, albeit it was in different circumstances. And what that whole experience has taught me is that you cannot impose solutions on people from the top. That one has to, what Rodney used to call, engage in active struggle in order to arrive at that point of cohesion. In the 70s and 80s, there was some consensus that the government of the day was out of control. And so therefore, the circumstances presented opportunities for joint racial action. I don't think that in the present circumstances, those opportunities are about to come, largely because the very thing that economists would say would lead us in that direction, and that is wealth. The coming of wealth seems to have played a negative role in terms of that march towards cohesion. And so, as a veteran, I would say that we have to engage what is before us and continue to do that. We have to do like we're doing here. Remove ourselves sometimes from the scene of the crime and have a conversation. If Guyanese can see 5 men, unfortunately there are no women, but 2 Indian men who believe strongly in their Indian identity. I can't speak for Dr. Blackman, but one black man who feels very strongly about his identity.
I'll just point out that my name is Blackman. So.
And I think if people, Guyanese of both races, see more of this, that we can have a conversation clearly with our differences, clearly with our differences, but yet can spend an hour and a half talking civilly to each other. I think that could send some signals that can help to clear the way so that we can get to that place. But like I said, one has to engage what is before us, while at the same time engage in the possibilities that are necessary for us to get to that point that we all want to get at.
I want to thank you all for being part of tonight's program. I want to apologize for the listeners for taking you over. I actually thought somehow got received in terms of 2 hours and 1.5. But I think the discussion was interesting. We did divert from the topic should have, but I think it was worth listening to the views of all of the individuals here, and it's a healthy way to move forward. I want to thank you again for being with us, and I want to thank all of you gentlemen, Ravi, Dr. Ramharack, and Blackman, Hinds, for the host, the persons behind this program, to have you engage in this way. Do have a good night until